Hello and welcome. Who owns your life and who has the right to decide if you live or die? A battle is raging between those for and those against an individual being free to make that choice. And it's complicated by the involvement of everyone from religious leaders and the government to doctors and the terminally ill. The term euthanasia first made headlines in the 1990s surrounding the physician-assisted suicides of Dr. Jack Kevorkian, who was labelled Dr. Death in the media. But the debates actually raged within the medical community for centuries. There have been a number of cases recently highlighting that the issue is far from resolved. In Italy, the court ruled that feeding tubes could be removed from a woman who'd been in a vegetative state for 17 years. But the government, under pressure from the Vatican, defied the ruling and tried to pass an emergency law that would prevent doctors from removing all life support from ailing patients. Last week, the patient died while the subject was still being debated. On today's program, we'll discuss the issues surrounding assisted suicide and the right to die and ask who makes the choice. Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE and enter the chat room to take part. And we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me to discuss these very complex issues are two people on different sides of the debate. From Seattle in Washington State, I'm joined by Terry BARNETT, the president of Compassion and Choices of Washington. Last week, that state became the second in the country, after Oregon, to approve the practice of death with dignity. Mr. Barnett's organization is a non-profit one that advocates for better end-of-life care and choices and urges patients and their families to find out whether or not their doctor will respect their end-of-life decisions. Also with us from our studios in London is Dr. Peter Saunders, the campaign director of the pressure group Care Not Killing, based in the UK. Assisted death in the United Kingdom is not legal, but it's been decriminalised in Switzerland and the Netherlands. Gentlemen, I welcome you both to the show. And Terry BARNETT, if I could start with you, please, sir. It seems that the key players in this debate over a person's life seem to be the government and the church, essentially, that the individual perhaps doesn't have as much say as many might think. Is that the case?
Not so much the government, but certainly some churches, the evangelical Protestant churches and the Catholic churches.
In terms of government legislation, though, whether it's making assisted suicide, death with dignity, the various phrases we'll discuss in a moment, making them legal or illegal or decriminalizing them, surely that's a big factor.
Well, the change is an important one. The law in our state against assisting suicide was enacted in the 1970s. It's never been applied in any circumstance that I'm aware of. However, it has had a huge impediment effect on physicians' willingness to talk with patients about issues of what to expect from terminal illnesses and terminal suffering, and also aid in dying.
Now, Mr. BARNETT, could I ask, I sort of wonder, many of our viewers out there watching will be saying, America, a country that's supposed to champion the individual's rights, seems to be one where, in this issue at least, the individuals have very, very limited say. Why is the issue such a sensitive one in America?
I think there's something of a social taboo around death generally. It's sort of innate in us to want to live. Certainly, a very central part of religious belief surrounds conceptions of death and what happens after death. And for a long time, there has been a religious tradition that one does not tamper with such things. One doesn't try to change the course of things. One just waits for God to dispose of things. And there's been a tension between that and the strong political belief in our country, and especially in our part of the country, of individual liberties, of rights to privacy, that the government should not tamper with unless truly necessary.
Dr. Saunders, good to have you with us too. And your organization, Care Not Killing, your alliance, opposes any kind of assisted death. Do you believe there is always an alternative?
Yes, requests for assisted suicide or euthanasia are actually extremely rare if patients are really well looked after. The desire for assisted dying is coming largely in this country from those we would call the worried well, who've perhaps heard stories on the media or have had relatives who've died badly, but actually amongst terminally ill patients whose physical, social, psychological and spiritual needs are being properly attended to, requests are actually very, very rare. And even in terms of those Brits going to Switzerland, we've seen just 100 in 5 years, about 20 a year. And when you consider that there have been almost 3 million deaths in Britain from all other causes during that time, it's a very, very small number indeed.
Fundamentally, though, Dr. Saunders, if there is an individual, and perhaps it is a case of a serious terminal illness, shouldn't an individual have a choice? Shouldn't they be able to make the choice whether or not, or how they go, basically?
I think in a democratic society we all recognise there are limits to human freedom, and we're not entitled to exercise choices that endanger the reasonable freedoms of others. And the debate here in the UK has been largely around areas of public safety. Care Not Killing Alliance has faith groups in it, but a lot of the other groups are disability rights groups, medical groups, healthcare providers that are coming from no faith background whatsoever. And the key question here has been, should we change the law for a very, very small number of individuals who are really persistent in their desire to end their lives? And Parliament here looked at it extensively 2 years ago, and they decided no, for the very reason that if they did, they would put vulnerable people at risk. And we're talking about the depressed, the elderly, those who are sick or suffering from terminal illnesses, that it just simply wasn't worth it. And so for the balance of harm, we should leave the law as it is at the moment, where assisted dying of all kinds remains illegal.
Let's get a caller in on the line from New Zealand. Bart has joined us. Bart, good to have you with us. What's your question, please?
Yes, people that are living in Africa suffering from starvation and the ravages of war, such as rape and whatnot, should they be allowed to have assisted suicide instead of watching their children starve, etc.?
Okay, perhaps Terry Barnett, I could put that to you first. Whether you consider that situation?
That's completely outside the scope of the issue that has been presented and approved by the voters of Washington, or that has been presented to any state in the United States.
Actually, on a thought, Mr. Barnett, this is something that might help a lot of our viewers, is clarifying the terminology. It came, well, let me put it in the form of an email that came from Corrine Collins in Florida in the USA. Corrine wrote in saying, "I choose not to call it aided killings. Just plain death would be more appropriate. This subject is strictly a personal choice. Everyone has a right to an opinion, but not the right to make other people's decisions for them." I wonder, when it comes to using these terms, aided killings and so on, there's death with dignity, there's euthanasia, there's assisted suicide, assisted death. How much does that complicate the situation, Mr. Barnett?
I think it often does complicate it, because we want to use terminology that's going to expand discourse on the issue, not cut it off and substitute for it. And the opponents of aid in dying use suicide to cut off discussion, to impose a judgment that stops discussion. In the United States, anyway, suicide implies a desire to stop living. People who want aid in dying want to live. They don't want to die. Some people, when they have had the best that medical care can deliver, still experience suffering that cannot be relieved, not just physical suffering, but also psychic suffering. And for some people, that suffering becomes worse than death. In that circumstance, they're not choosing to end their lives, although that's the effect if they take medication. They're choosing to end terminal suffering that cannot be relieved in any other way. One of the things that's not appreciated sufficiently is that aid in dying, at least in Oregon, and I expect the same thing to happen in Washington, helps far more people than the small number who obtain and use prescriptions. We have seen in Oregon that the use of hospice has gone up dramatically. 98% of the people who availed themselves of aid in dying in Oregon last year were in hospice. The incidence of people dying of terminal illness in hospitals goes way down. More people die at home, surrounded by their families and loved ones. Doctors pay more attention to improving the quality of end-of-life care. Doctors are able to talk more frankly and openly with their patients about terminal illness and options for care at the end of life.
Right. Dr. Saunders, these sound like very valid arguments. So you were saying that, of course, there's the people who think that they would like to die, and that perhaps having legislation restricts them from essentially committing suicide. But the points raised by Mr. Barnett are quite valid, and perhaps people going to doctors looking for assisted dying might then be assessed more accurately by professional medical care and helped if it comes to it merely just a psychological condition.
I think in Britain we've been very fortunate to have an extremely good palliative care service which really does cater for dying people in all areas, and Mr. Barnett has mentioned that the suffering isn't all physical. In fact, pain and shortness of breath can be virtually controlled entirely with the right kind of drugs. A lot of what's pushing the demand for euthanasia here from a very small group of people is the feeling that life has lost its purpose and is no longer worth living. And when we look at those who've gone to Switzerland to end their lives, they really are the exceptions rather than the rule, and they come from right across the disease spectrum. Some of them are terminally ill, some of them have chronic illnesses, some of them are paralysed, some of them are simply depressed, some of them are just tired of life. But when we look at people with similar conditions in all those categories, we find that the vast majority, from the terminally ill right through to those who are suffering from chronic illnesses, do actually want to go on living. The disability rights lobby here are always saying to us, we want assisted living, not assisted dying. And so the answer to the question that was asked from the person from New Zealand earlier was that if people in Africa are asking, I think first of all that requests in Africa for assisted dying are probably very, very rare indeed, from my experience of having worked as a surgeon in Africa. And what people really want is good care and food. And if we're offering them a lethal injection or a glass of barbiturate rather than actually attending to their needs, then we're not practicing good medicine at all. But as I said before, it comes back to the question of the balance of harm and the danger to public safety if such a law like that were passed here. And we're certainly not reassured by what we've heard coming out of Oregon State.
As we pause, let me remind you, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see there's a debate taking place there right now. We've also put a poll into the chat room where we're asking, should assisted deaths be allowed? Let us know what you think. You can join us in the Live Station chat room for that. We'll be right back.